When I first heard about Reddit, I had no idea how addictive it would become. The online world fascinated me, especially the dark corners where people shared their secrets and sought advice on relationships, betrayal, and cheating. Little did I know that I'd soon have a story of my own to tell, one that would fit perfectly into one of those notorious subreddits, something I could never have imagined happening in real life. It all started when I began my last year of high school. It was supposed to be just another ordinary year, but that was far from the case. I attended a small private school where everyone knew each other. The class sizes were tiny, and the teachers, having been there for decades, had built strong reputations. One of those teachers was Mrs. McAllister, who had been teaching English literature for over 30 years. At 60 years old, she was the school's matriarch. She commanded respect and admiration from both students and staff. I'd heard about her for years, but had never taken one of her classes until my final semester. From the beginning, Mrs. McAllister had a certain presence. She was intelligent, well-spoken, and seemed to genuinely care about her students. But there was something else about her, something subtle that I couldn't quite put my finger on. She always made eye contact with me for a bit longer than necessary. Her compliments felt just a little too personal, and she seemed to single me out in class discussions. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, she was 60 years old, married, and had grandchildren. The idea that there could be something inappropriate going on never crossed my mind, or maybe I was just too naive to see it. As the semester progressed, things started to change. I found myself staying after class to ask her questions or discuss assignments, and she seemed eager to engage. She would smile and laugh, touch my arm lightly, and talk about how mature I was for my age. I still didn't think much of it. Teachers often encouraged students who showed interest in their subjects, right? But then came the day when everything shifted. It was a Friday afternoon, and I had stayed late to finish a paper. Mrs. McAllister had been unusually kind that day, giving me a lot of praise for my work, saying I had a talent that most students lack. It felt good to hear such compliments from someone like her. After class, she asked if I could stay back for a few minutes to go over my paper one-on-one. I didn't think twice about it. I respected her, and besides, I wanted to improve. We sat at her desk, the classroom empty and quiet, with only the sound of the clock ticking. She pulled her chair closer to mine and leaned in, her face inches away from mine. Her perfume was overpowering, a sweet, heavy scent that lingered in the air. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but again, I thought nothing of it. She started to compliment me on how insightful my paper was, but then her tone changed. Her words became more personal. "You know," she said, her voice low, "you're a very special young man. There's something about you that's different from the others. You're mature, confident. You have an old soul." Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a strange tension building in the room. Thank you, Mrs. McAllister," I stammered, unsure of what to say. She smiled softly and leaned in even closer. "You know, I've been teaching for a long time, and I've never met a student quite like you. You remind me of someone I used to know, a long time ago." Her hand found its way to my arm, her fingers brushing lightly against my skin. I froze, my heart raced, and I suddenly felt trapped. Was I imagining this? Surely she wasn't flirting with me. She was 60 years old. My teacher, this couldn't be happening. But before I could react, she continued. "There's something I've been thinking about for a while," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "You're mature, and I think you can handle something special." I swallowed hard, not sure where this was going. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. Her smile widened, and she leaned in so close that I could feel her breath on my face. "I want you to do something for me," she said, her hand now resting on my knee. "Something that's just between us. Something intimate." My stomach dropped. I felt like the room was spinning, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She couldn't possibly be asking what I thought she was. But as her hand slowly moved higher up my leg, the truth hit me like a freight train. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't. This isn't right." But she didn't stop. Her grip tightened, and her eyes gleamed with something dark, something predatory. "You don't have to be afraid," she said. "This will be our little secret. No one has to know." I pushed her hand away, and stood up, my mind racing. I felt sick to my stomach, disgusted by what she had just suggested. "I can't do this," I said firmly. "You're my teacher. This is wrong." Her expression changed in an instant. The sweet, caring Mrs. McAllister I had known disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You don't want to make this difficult, do you?" she said, her voice dripping with menace. "I have a lot of power in this school, and I can make things very hard for you if you don't cooperate." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she threatening me? My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. If I reported her, who would believe me? She was beloved by everyone, a respected figure in the school. I was just a kid, a nobody. And she knew it. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice shaking with fear and anger. "You'll regret this," she hissed as I walked toward the door. "No one will believe you. You'll be the one who gets in trouble, not me." I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to get out of there, away from her. My heart was pounding as I fled the classroom, my mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. I felt dirty, violated, and terrified. What if she was right? What if no one believed me? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her predatory smile, the way her hand had lingered on my leg. I felt trapped, helpless, like I had no way out. And that's when I turned to Reddit. I had seen stories on Reddit before, stories of people who had been in situations like mine, who didn't know where to turn. I found a thread about inappropriate relationships between teachers and students, and for the first time I realized that I wasn't alone. Other people had gone through this too, and they had found ways to fight back. But my situation felt different. Mrs. McAllister wasn't just any teacher, she was respected, revered even. If I spoke up, I'd be going up against someone with decades of experience and a spotless reputation. And then there was the fact that she had threatened me. What if she followed through on her promise to ruin my life? The next few weeks were a nightmare. Mrs. McAllister didn't make any more advances, but she didn't have to. Every time I saw her in class, I felt her eyes on me, watching, waiting. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think straight. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. "We've received some troubling reports," the principal said, his expression serious. "Mrs. McAllister has informed us that you've been behaving inappropriately toward her, and we need to discuss your future at this school." Then, one day, it all came to a head. I was called into the principal's office without warning. As I walked in, my heart sank. Mrs. McAllister was there, sitting across from the principal with a smug smile on her face. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. She had turned the tables on me, just like she had threatened. She was accusing me of the very thing she had done, and I had no idea how to defend myself. "She's lying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's the one who—" But the principal cut me off. "We take accusations like this very seriously, and Mrs. McAllister has been a respected teacher here for many years. We'll be conducting a full investigation, but for now, I'm afraid we have no choice but to suspend you pending the outcome." Suspended. For something I hadn't done. I couldn't believe it. My world was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Mrs. McAllister smiled at me as I left the office, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She had won, and I was powerless to stop her. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a deep depression. I didn't know who to turn to, didn't know how to prove my innocence. I was scared, angry, and alone. But then, out of desperation, I turned back to Reddit. I posted my story anonymously, detailing everything that had happened, how Mrs. McAllister had made advances, how she had threatened me, and how she had turned the tables on me by accusing me of the very thing she had done. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe some advice, maybe just a place to vent, but the response was overwhelming. People flooded the thread with comments, offering support, advice, and most importantly, validation. For the first time since it had all started, I didn't feel alone. There were others who believed me, even if the people at my school didn't. One comment in particular stood out. It was from someone who claimed to have been in a similar situation. They said the key was to gather evidence, anything I could find that would prove what had really happened. At first, I didn't think I had any, but then I remembered something: Mrs. McAllister's texts. She had sent me a few messages early in the semester, mostly about assignments, but looking back, some of them had a strange, almost flirtatious tone. They weren't overtly inappropriate, but if someone looked closely, they might see what I saw. I combed through my phone, finding every message I could. There weren't many, but they painted a picture of a teacher who had crossed boundaries. Armed with that small piece of evidence, I decided to take a risk. I went to my parents. I had been dreading this conversation. My parents were strict, conservative, and had always taught me to respect authority, especially my teachers. But I couldn't hide this from them anymore. I sat them down and told them everything: how Mrs. McAllister had made advances, how she had threatened me, how I was now suspended because of her lies. At first, they didn't believe me. My dad even got angry, accusing me of making excuses for my suspension. But then I showed them the texts. My mom read them over, her face growing paler with each word. "This isn't normal," she said quietly. "Teachers don't send messages like this." My dad looked over her shoulder, his expression shifting from disbelief to concern. "We need to do something," he said. With my parents on my side, we decided to hire a lawyer. It wasn't easy, our family wasn't exactly well off, and legal fees were expensive, but they believed me now, and that gave me the strength to keep fighting. The lawyer took my case seriously and suggested we gather more evidence, including witness statements from other students who might have noticed Mrs. McAllister's behavior. He also advised us to file a formal complaint with the school district. It was a long, grueling process. Mrs. McAllister continued to teach while the investigation dragged on, and I remained suspended. The school administration seemed hesitant to take action against her, likely because of her long-standing reputation and the lack of concrete evidence beyond my word. But my lawyer was persistent, and eventually the district launched an official inquiry. During the investigation, several students came forward, some anonymously, others more bravely. They recounted moments when Mrs. McAllister had acted inappropriately with them, as well, nothing as severe as what had happened to me, but enough to show a pattern of behavior. Some mentioned how she had always been overly friendly with the boys in class, how she would compliment them on their looks, or touch their arms and shoulders in ways that made them uncomfortable. It wasn't enough to fully incriminate her, but it was enough to cast doubt on her character. The texts I had saved also became a crucial piece of evidence. While they weren't explicit, they showed a level of familiarity that was inappropriate for a teacher-student relationship. Combined with the witness statements and my own testimony, the district couldn't ignore the case any longer. They suspended Mrs. McAllister while the investigation continued. But that wasn't the end of it. Mrs. McAllister fought back, hiring her own lawyer and claiming that I had fabricated the texts and manipulated the other students into making false accusations. She portrayed herself as the victim of a malicious student who had become obsessed with her and was trying to ruin her career. It was a classic case of gaslighting, and it made the whole process even more exhausting. I began to doubt myself. What if no one ever believed me? What if this dragged on for months, or even years, and I never got justice? The weight of the situation crushed me, and I sank deeper into depression. There were days when I didn't want to get out of bed, when I wondered if it was all worth it. But then I'd log back onto Reddit, where people continued to offer support and advice, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigation concluded. The district found that while there wasn't enough evidence to fully prosecute Mrs. McAllister for her behavior, there was enough to justify her termination. The school couldn't risk keeping her on staff with so many allegations against her. She was forced to retire early, her once untouchable reputation in tatters. It wasn't the complete victory I had hoped for. Mrs. McAllister never faced criminal charges, and I never received a formal apology from the school for how they had treated me. But I was allowed to return to class, and my suspension was wiped from my record. The other students who had come forward felt a sense of closure too, knowing that their voices had contributed to bringing the truth to light. In the aftermath, things slowly began to return to normal. I graduated on time, though my final months at school were marked by whispers and rumors. Some students believed me, others didn't. But at that point, I didn't care anymore. I had fought for the truth, and in the end, I had won, at least in my own way. Years later, I still think about Mrs. McAllister sometimes. I wonder how someone who had been so respected, so admired, could have fallen so far. But more than that, I think about how easy it is for people in positions of power to manipulate and betray the trust of those who look up to them. It's a story as old as time: cheating, betrayal, and the abuse of power, but when you're the one living through it, it feels uniquely personal. I'm grateful for the people on Reddit who helped me navigate that dark time in my life. Without them, I might never have had the courage to speak up, to fight back against someone who had tried to ruin me. It's strange to think that a place as chaotic as Reddit could have been my lifeline, but in the end, it was. Looking back, I realize how close I came to losing everything: my education, my future, my sense of self-worth. But I didn't let Mrs. McAllister win. I didn't let her destroy me. And that, more than anything, is what I take away from the whole experience. Betrayal can come from the most unexpected places, but so can strength. After Mrs. McAllister was forced to retire, I hoped life would settle down and I could move on. But as with all things tied to betrayal and scandal, the aftermath wasn't so simple. The rumors about what happened between me and Mrs. McAllister swirled around the school long after she was gone. Some of my classmates avoided me altogether, treating me like I was guilty of something, though I wasn't sure if they thought I had been involved with her willingly, or if they just didn't know how to act around someone who had brought down a beloved teacher. Other students whispered when I walked by, exchanging knowing looks or giving me pitying glances. I didn't know which was worse: being treated like I was guilty or like I was a victim. Both left me feeling isolated, and I found myself retreating more into the online world where I could escape from the mess my real life had become. But even on Reddit, there were echoes of what had happened. My original post had gained attention, and as more people became aware of my story, I received private messages, some supportive, others doubting my version of events. Some users accused me of lying, saying I had probably led Mrs. McAllister on, that she was the real victim. Others tried to dig for more details, prying into my personal life in ways that made me uncomfortable. I quickly realized that even though I had survived the ordeal with Mrs. McAllister, there was no going back to the way things had been before. The experience had changed me, hardened me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Despite all of this, I managed to finish the school year and graduate. My parents, though proud that I had stood up for myself, could sense that something in me had shifted. I was quieter, more withdrawn, and I didn't share much about what I was going through, either with them or anyone else. It felt like no one could truly understand what it was like to be caught in the web of betrayal and manipulation by someone you were supposed to trust. Over time, though, I started to rebuild. I went away for college, and it felt like a fresh start, a place where no one knew what had happened, where I wasn't that kid who had taken down a teacher. I kept a low profile, focusing on my studies and staying out of trouble. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was able to breathe freely, without the constant weight of judgment hanging over me. But as much as I tried to move on, there were moments when the memories of Mrs. McAllister crept back in, uninvited and unwelcome. I would have dreams where I was back in her classroom, sitting at her desk while she leaned in close to whisper things I didn't want to hear. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, feeling like I was trapped all over again. It wasn't until my second year of college that I started to work through those feelings. A psychology professor had assigned a paper on power dynamics and the abuse of authority, and it brought everything rushing back. Writing that paper forced me to confront what had happened with Mrs. McAllister in a way I hadn't done before. I had always framed it as an incident of inappropriate behavior. But as I researched the topic more, I realized how much deeper the betrayal went. She had used her power as a teacher, someone I was supposed to trust, to manipulate and control me. Worse, she had turned it into a game, threatening me and then playing the victim when I fought back. That realization hit me hard. It wasn't just that she had made inappropriate advances or threatened my future. It was that she had abused the power imbalance between us to make me feel helpless, as if I had no control over my own life. I had spent so long feeling guilty, wondering if there was something I had done to invite her attention, but the truth was that the fault had never been mine. It had always been hers. After submitting that paper, I decided to see a counselor. For months, I had pushed down the feelings of anger, guilt, and confusion that Mrs. McAllister had left me with, but now I was ready to deal with them. Talking about it was hard at first. The counselor asked questions that forced me to relive the events in detail, and there were days when I left the sessions feeling worse than when I had arrived. But slowly things began to change. I started to let go of the guilt that had been weighing me down. I realized that I wasn't responsible for what Mrs. McAllister had done, no matter what anyone else believed. The turning point came when I finally shared the whole story with one of my college friends. Up until then, I had kept it to myself, afraid of being judged or disbelieved all over again. But my friend listened without interrupting, without jumping to conclusions or asking inappropriate questions. When I finished, she didn't look at me like I was damaged or strange. Instead, she said, "I'm really sorry you went through that. It wasn't your fault." Hearing those words felt like a weight being lifted off my chest. For so long, I had internalized the idea that somehow I had brought all of this on myself, that maybe if I hadn't stayed after class that day, or if I had handled things differently, it wouldn't have happened. But hearing someone I trusted tell me it wasn't my fault, it made all the difference. After that, I started to open up more. I told a few other close friends, and I began to feel less alone in my experience. It didn't make the memories go away, but it helped me feel less haunted by them. I also returned to Reddit, not to post more about my story, but to offer support to others going through similar situations. I knew how isolating it could be, how easy it was to feel like no one would believe you. And I wanted to be the person for someone else that Reddit had been for me when I needed it the most. In the years that followed, I slowly pieced my life back together. I graduated from college and moved to a new city to start a job that I loved. Mrs. McAllister was a distant memory by then, but there were still times when I thought about her, about how close she had come to destroying my future and how I had fought my way back. I knew now that I had been a victim of betrayal, not just by her but by a system that had protected her for so long. But I also knew that I wasn't defined by that betrayal. I had survived, and in doing so, I had discovered a strength I didn't know I had. I had learned how to stand up for myself, how to trust my instincts, and how to rebuild after everything seemed lost. And in the end, that was the lesson I took away from it all, not the betrayal, not the manipulation, but the strength it took to keep going, even when it felt like the world was against me. The experience with Mrs. McAllister taught me one of life's hardest lessons, that not everyone you trust has your best interests at heart. And sometimes those who should be your protectors are the very ones who seek to hurt you. But it also taught me that no matter how dark things seem, there is always a way forward. And for that, I am stronger,